Well, hello plant lovers. Welcome to my channel. It's Matthew in Melbourne, Australia. Thank you for finding me. If you're new here, I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here without any grow lights or greenhouses or humidifiers or equipment, really just me and them struggling along inside or outside or not at all. So plant lovers of the world, if that sounds like your bag, do hit subscribe. My ramblings are amateur, but it's about me figuring out how to grow things in my climate, and that might help you in your orchid journey, which is kind of very much what the point of today's video is all about. Yes, plant lovers, a little bit of an orchid experiment follow-up. So there's nothing perhaps dramatic, well, actually there is, but there's nothing obviously dramatic to show. There's no flowers, there's nothing that we can get our teeth into. But I feel I'm making progress with a group of orchids which are quite tricky in my climate, and they are Catasetum types. So yes, quite an extraordinary bunch of orchids with quite extraordinary flowers and not ideally suited, I don't think, to my climate. Anyway, I don't actually think I've ever seen one in the flesh in bloom in Melbourne, and wherever I've been, I've never seen one in bloom either. So there you go. I'm quite sure, well, I know there are people that flower them here. Michael Coker, who I've made some videos with, is a great grower, and he has a lot of Catesetum type of orchids and grows and flowers them very well here in Melbourne. But he grows his in an outdoor heated greenhouse, so quite different to me. So this video is really about how I am figuring out where and how to grow these orchids in my climate, which is perhaps not an ideal one for growing them in the first place. So first of all, Catasetum, so that is a very particular sort of species genera. These are all hybrids which are all derived from quite a few different species actually, but they all kind of have similar characteristics in terms of how they grow. So we can just generally call them Catasetum types. I think that's easy enough. And it's a group of orchids from the Americas, so sort of Central America down. They cover a vast range of territory, so obviously that means a vastly different type of growing conditions for many of the species types. There's quite a few peculiarities about them, so yeah, let's get into it, plant lovers. Catesetum, not even 101, because this isn't the definitive growing instruction, but it's where I'm up to thus far. Now, about 2 years ago, I made a video called Orchids I'm Experimenting With, and I just had a look at it, and these plants were some of those. So they're still alive, which is great 2 years later. It's been a journey, it's been a struggle, and quite hard to find information. Now, there is actually lots of information out there, there's lots of videos, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I think the thing is, no matter what you can find online, you've got to figure out what works for your particular conditions and environment. And it's not always sort of one size fits all for growing conditions and the care that you need to give and the timing of the different elements of the growth of a particular orchid that you might need to meet. So it is a bit of a journey. So it's great to get lots of feedback from people around the world who do this and do that, but you've got to see which of those bits work for you. And I think I figured out what works for me. The proof of the pudding is, of course, flowers, none of which these have. However, we might get to that in a minute. Alrighty, so we're using the word Catasetum type, even though these are all hybrids and they're created from different species. And I'll get to the names of each one in a minute because there's a whole narrative around that too. So I love a little bit of Latin, love a bit of nomenclature. So the name Catasetum comes from the Greek, surprisingly enough, cata meaning downward, and Latin seta meaning bristles. Downward bristles. So it's to do with the flower. I must say, nomenclature that's about the specifics of the structure of the flower itself doesn't really excite me. I like something that refers to the growth habit or a name, a bit of history or something like that. Anyway, that's where Catasetum comes from. The other interesting fact is that they have very distinctly different male and female flowers, which caused a great deal of confusion to 19th century botanists who thought they were very different species. They're not. Another interesting thing, this is a book called Orchids, a practical guide for gardeners by Brian and Wilma Rittershausen, is that, and let's read this, While epiphytes dwell upon living trees, a few orchids, such as the Catasetum species, are saprophytic, living upon decaying trees where their roots penetrate the softer tissue beneath the bark. Their lifespan is more limited than that of epiphytes because dead trees in the tropics will remain only for a few years before fungi and termites take their toll. Therefore, the saprophytes must be fast growing and produce seed quickly so that the next generation can move on to other habitats. So there you go. There's some clues. Anyway, let us now go over the kind of growing and life cycle of these plants and the care that I'm giving them and how I think it has worked for me. So as that book mentioned, these plants have a very rapid life cycle. So they grow in an annual cycle. And as you can see quite clearly here, you have old sort of shriveled pseudobulbs. So you get a bulb which grows in spring and it grows magnificently fast and quite large, putting a huge amount of energy into producing a bulb with leaves, which will then actually bloom. So it does this very quickly. And as that book said, I think some of them anyway need to do it because the place in which they're growing is not stable. So they need to produce seed that's going to get distributed and find a new spot for their plantlets to grow in. So you have this very definite cycle of boom bust, an enormous amount of growth, enormous amount of foliage and photosynthesizing and energy production, and then dormancy, leaf drop, rinse and repeat every year the cycle carries on. So in growing them, you've got to kind of understand where that cycle sits in your particular climate. And so the thing about a plant that goes into a very hard dormancy, which these do, is that some plants that go into a hard dormancy do not want any water at all, and others want a little bit, and some. So it can be quite confusing. My experience with these here in Melbourne is that mine do thrive and survive on absolutely no water whatsoever from the period that they go into dormancy to the period that they start to grow in spring. But we'll go through that in a minute. The fact is though, this is a cyclical plant, does all its growth in one season, the leaves drop, it goes into a hard dormancy, and then the next spring it repeats the process again. All right, so basic conditions then. This is an orchid that loves light, bright light, sort of cat layer light. So they also like warmth, humidity, air movement. I mean, not dissimilar to many orchids. So what I have figured out works for me, because Melbourne can be quite damp and cool in winter, and obviously quite cold at night. So I move these out in spring when the winter minimums are warm enough to not chill the plant too much, and I hang them up quite high so that they get incredibly bright indirect light for the entire warm season until we get to autumn when the nighttime temperatures start to drop again, and then I bring them in to begin the process of going into dormancy. So the bright light is a really important factor in their health, growth, development and flowering. And although the leaves are quite fine, they do manage that bright light very well. So let's go through the cycle from the beginning then. So it's spring and you've got these nude canes which look pretty shriveled and dead. Now if they are looking crazily shriveled, you can give them a little bit of water occasionally during that winter period. Otherwise I just leave mine and they do get quite shriveled but not completely desiccated. In spring, at the base of last year's new pseudobulb, you will see a little green shoot coming out, and it could be from anywhere around the plant. So once you see that happening, great, still don't water it. It's still bone dry. You need to wait until that shoot is, a couple of inches or about 6 or 7 centimeters tall, and you can see the new little white roots coming out from the base, and they're going to be relatively long as well. So once that new growth has got to quite a large height, and this can be quite hard to do, only then would you start watering it. But before you do that, it's time to repot it or just start to enhance the medium that it's already in if you're not going to repot. It is, I think, a good idea to repot though, because these plants do so much growth in that season. Good idea to put as much nutrient as you can in your medium to give that plant as good a go as it can get in that season to grow and therefore flower for you. So in spring, you get your new growth, you wait till it's quite tall and resist the urge to water it, because you will just probably rot it if you do. Once it's big enough and the roots are long enough, then repot the whole thing into a medium, and I use medium bark a lot of sphagnum moss and a lot of perlite, because these plants need a lot of moisture. They do want to dry out, but they need a lot of constant moisture and feeding. So that's the medium that I find works best for me. So once you've repotted it and your growth's at a reasonable height, then you're going to start the watering process. So build it up relatively quickly, and then throughout the growing period I just basically keep mine moist all the time, and I feed them as often as I can remember. So when I repot, I put much more than I normally would in any other orchid, slow release fertilizer granules into the medium, and that's just a fertilizer that's for any flowering plant, not an orchid specific one, but you could do whatever you want. So a little bit of slow release fertilizer in that. I also put a little bit of horse poo in there, broken down horse poo manure from a bag that you buy in a garden centre. Just a little bit of organic matter in there, just to add even more nutrients. And then once the plant really starts to grow, you need to liquid feed it or even add more slow release fertilizer throughout that growing season. And I would probably say maybe every second watering, add something, whether it's a liquid fertilizer or a liquid tonic or something of that nature. I still dial it down to about 1/8, 1/10 of the recommended dose, but I fertilize them like there's no tomorrow. So I certainly fertilize these more than anything else because it's got a whole lot of growth to do in a fairly short space of time. So you've been doing that and all's well. Now we start to head into autumn. So let me talk about my climate. So Melbourne, we don't have the same climatic zones as you do in the States, for example. So Melbourne's climate is a little hard to describe, but we don't get freezing winters. It's a little similar to some of the Bayside areas of California in terms of climate. We do have hot summers, but it does rain in summer. So we are sometimes described as wet Mediterranean or warm temperate. It sort of depends. But anyway, essentially we have hot summers, which do rain, and we have cool, wet winters that don't freeze but can get quite close. So in autumn, when our nighttime minimums start to get to about 10 degrees, the 50 Fahrenheit stage, that's when I bring mine in. So I bring all the plants in and I put them on a north facing window, which in the southern hemisphere is the brightest. In the northern hemisphere, you put them on a south facing window where they're still getting really bright light, but it's just a little warmer at night than being outside. Depends where you are and what time and what your nighttime minimums are. But I put them on the staircase on a window ledge. And so the nighttime temperature does drop and it gets quite cool, and they're close to the glass. They'll get a bit of reflected cool from the glass, but obviously it's not as cold as if they're outside. But then during the day, they're still getting lots of bright light, but it's still relatively cool. So it's that cooling temperature, the shortening of the day and restriction of moisture that triggers the plants to go into dormancy, which is what you want. So when I bring them in autumn and the leaves start to turn, maybe starting to look a little bit sad at the end, that's when you start to pull back on your watering. So from watering it, say, every couple of days or keeping it moist in summer with lots of heat and lots of humidity and lots of sun, lots of growth, you then just pull it right back. So I then water mine maybe about once a week. And now, as we're really getting into dormancy, and dormancy you can see is happening when the leaves start to turn yellow, that's when I would really dial it down to maybe once a fortnight, every 2 weeks, until the leaves are dropped, and then stop completely, unless you've got flowers, in which case I would continue that sort of gentle watering every week or 2 weeks until the flower stops. But I don't know about that because mine have never flowered yet. So then, once your leaves like this started to go yellow, they will just drop off. That's not a problem. And the others will drop off. And then just stop watering it. Leave it in that bright, cool space all winter. Resist the temptation to water them. And ta-da, 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 in spring, you'll get your new growth and that whole process begins again. So that all sounds great, doesn't it? Yes, but I've had no flowers. Why is that, Matthew? Well, I think a few things. So it took me a while to figure out just the subtleties of when they needed to come in for me. So this plant, for example, it is very easy to rot these bulbs if you get them moist and cold or cool. So 2 autumns ago, I just didn't bring these in fast enough and rot started. It's actually started on a few. I had 5, I've now got 3, I lost 2. And this one had already started to rot, but I treated it with an antifungal, and by some miracle, the rot stopped and it still had enough oomph to produce a growth the next year. So I saved this one in the nick of time. But I did lose two, and that was really because I was still watering them and having them in a damp environment when the nighttime temperatures got too cold and they just rotted. So that's when I realized the exact timing of bringing them in and being really careful not to keep them damp and cold as the season shifted into autumn. The other thing is that these were all seedlings, so they're all quite small plants. And like many things, I think it just takes time for the plant to bulk up to get to a flowering stage. So looking at some of the growths, like this one has got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the sixth growth, which you could presume is the sixth year. Now, it may have flowered earlier because I've just been a bad grower. So maybe it wouldn't have taken 6 years if I knew what I was doing, but it's taken me 6 years to get this to the point where I think it has a flower spike, but we'll get to that. So I think one of the reasons they haven't flowered is that when I bought them, they were quite young, maybe 2 or 3 year old seedlings out of the flask, and it just takes them a bit of time to grow. Coupled with, I'm not in the most perfect growing environment for them, coupled with not knowing what I was doing. All right, so let's look at the exact ones I've got. So this one here, which you can see is very much going into dormancy. See, the leaves are looking really tired and yellowing. This one is Fredclarkeara After Dark Baker's Black Hole. Fred, I think that could have had a better name. Anyway, so this brings us to information. Now, Fred Clark is a Californian grower, and he is, I don't know, maybe the master of Catasetum hybridization. He has produced extraordinary numbers of hybrids and intergeneric crosses. And there is a lot of content from him about growing orchids, either in print or online. So you'll find videos, you'll find articles, very easy to find. The point with that, though, is that he's obviously very experienced, but he's also growing in a very specific environment, which is not the same as mine and perhaps not the same as yours. So it's great to see that and read it and hear what he has to say, but then you've got to figure out, well, what of that is going to work for me in my conditions and climate, whether I grow them outdoors all year, indoors all year, or half and half like me. Fredclarkeara, which is the name that these intergenerics have been called, After Dark Baker's Black Hole. Strangely enough, it is a very dark flower. Now the After Dark types, and there's sort of lots of After Darks with different little names afterwards, they actually have 6 species ancestors. So imagine how complex that is. But it is still, I think, possible to generalize about the care for these, even though it's got quite a mixed genealogical background. So the other 2 species that have been mixed with Catesetum are Clouesia and Mormodes, and they all have a similar sort of growth habit in terms of they produce a bulb in a season, it does all this huge growth, it goes into dormancy and it flowers. But they're just from different areas and different sort of genetic types. But ultimately, it's those 3 that have been mixed over time to produce these. Okay, next cab off our Fredclarkeara rank, thank you Fred, is Fredclarkeara After Dark SVO. And this one is a more speckled, sort of leopard printy type of flower. So more browns and golds, not that dark type as the others. But can you see a very, very different growth habit? So although it's an after dark type, that bulb is not as big and the previous bulbs were not as big. Now, is that just my bad growing, or does this plant have ancestry from one of those species that just makes it a little smaller in terms of its bulb and its growth? I don't know. Anyway, no sign of a flower spike on this one, and I think next year I'm going to really focus on food and watering of this just to see if it makes a difference to the annual growth cycle. And then we come to the triumph of the piece, Fredclarkeara Midnight Lace. Guess what that looks like? Yes, it's very dark, but with a frilled edge to the flower. And plant lovers of the world, what do we see nestling in there but a little green nib, which to me spells flower spike. So what I've been able to find in Melbourne, in my part of the world, is that often these Fredclarkeara types will bloom while there are still leaves, late summer into autumn, into early winter, really depends on conditions, etc. And because I've never really seen one in bloom and never really met anyone who's grown them well, I've never known when and how it flowers. So I figured out that this is the time it should be flowering. So it should be flowering before it goes into dormancy. or just before it goes into dormancy. And that is a green shoot. Now, I wouldn't be getting a green shoot for a new growth until the plant has gone through its dormancy cycle. So in spring of next year. So I really think this is a flower spike, not a new growth just coming at an unusually early time, because I just don't think it would do that. So I am very excited, plant lovers, because I think my experimentation may have paid off and I might for the first time be getting a flower spike from one of these types of orchids. So as you can see with this, if it is a flower spike, hopefully it is, but the flower spikes do come from the base of the lately matured pseudobulb, such as that, and they will arch out with all the flowers along it. And I've looked at lots of pictures of these endlessly, and I've seen many a plant that has multiple flower spikes, well, one or two from the pseudobulb. So there is a chance that you can get a couple of spikes per bulb, which would be amazing. We will all have to watch this space, because if this flowers, believe me, you're all going to know. Now, the only other thing which happens to these orchids, perhaps that doesn't really happen to any of my other orchids, is they really get spider mite. Spider mites love these leaves, and there is a temptation not to treat them because the leaves are going to drop off, and the spider mites tend to find mine towards the end of the season. And you think, oh, just let him go because the leaves are going to drop off. But whilst the leaves are green, they're still photosynthesizing and producing energy, so you should really deal with it. Also, it's not necessarily great to have a plant infested with spider mites inside, particularly if you grow other tropical things, which spider mites love. Anyway, so this one particularly always gets afflicted with spider mites, and you might be able to see some of the discoloration is very particular to spider mites. It is also, though, going to dormancy, so they are turning yellow and dying. So again, I'm not that concerned with the spider mite issue at this period, but I am still spraying them, and spraying them about once every 5 days for about 2 weeks, just to catch each cycle of their hatching, to see if I can nip it in the bud, and also just to not have spider mites inside. But every year I get spider mites on these. How they find them, I don't know. Where they come from, it's a miracle, isn't it? Spider mites are tenacious little beasts. Anyway, that is, I think, the major problem. The only other thing that might happen is if you're growing them outside, the new growths are so juicy that they might be eaten by munching things, caterpillars, bugs, etc., or even slugs or snails if they are thus inclined. Mine are always quite high up, so things like that tend not to get to them. And also it's a little early in the season for caterpillars. So the only thing I ever get on mine, spider mites. So there we are, plant lovers. Who knows what's going to happen, but I really, really, really hope that is a flower spike that's growing in there. Very exciting. So these are all sort of going into dormancy now. I'm watering them about once every 2 weeks. The one with the flower spike, I will continue to water sort of once every 2 weeks until I see what's going on with that. I'm pretty sure it is a flower spike, in which case I will continue to water it every 2 weeks or so until that flower spike has died, and then I will just stop watering completely and allow the plant to go into dormancy. And as you can see, out of any of them, it is the one that is perhaps not showing as many pre-dormancy signs. So there we are. I think it wants to bloom for me and you. So there we are, plant lovers. By no means am I an expert in these. I've killed one that was incredibly expensive. Rotted it just rotted. And I killed another one that wasn't so expensive, but it's always hard when you kill things because you think, oh, I am just such a loser. Anyway, there are still 3 alive, and I think I figured it out now. Of course, the next level of successfully growing anything is the blooming, so we'll see what happens. But I will certainly do a follow-up video with this if it flowers. If not, we'll have to wait till next year. I'll do another review to see what they've done in the growing cycle. If you're interested, I might do a repotting video when I repot them. Again though, I am not the world's expert on these at all. It's my experience of growing these in my conditions, which is quite tricky. If I was further north in a more subtropical environment, I think it'd be a whole lot easier. But anyway, them's the breaks. I live in Melbourne, which is a great place to live, but perhaps not a great place for Catasetums. Anyway, plant lovers, I hope you've enjoyed my rambling and not much to show you. Anyway, it's a learning curve, isn't it? I post every week on a Friday, so if you're curious to know what I'm doing next Friday, you'll have to hit subscribe, join me for that adventure, and I look forward very much to seeing you next week.